Emma Clark had a talent for disappearing into rooms. Not the magic trick kind of disappearing. Not the kind that got noticed and admired. But the quiet, practiced art of being present without being seen. She had spent 4 years perfecting it. The plain navy cardigan. The sensible flat shoes. The hair pulled back into a neat, forgettable bun. The glasses that sat a little too large on her small nose. She blended into the background of every room she entered, and she preferred it that way. Tonight, however, the room she was disappearing into was the rooftop terrace of the Grand Whitmore Hotel. Draped in fairy lights and white orchids, humming with the kind of money that had its own particular smell, champagne and fresh flowers and the faint musk of ambition. It was the engagement party of Patrick Hale, one of Daniel Harrington's oldest friends, and the guest list read like the Forbes Young Achievers list had come to life and put on evening wear. Emma stood near the entrance with a small clutch bag in her hands, wearing a dress that Chloe had described as quietly elegant, and Emma herself would have described as borrowed and slightly too long. She had not planned to come. Daniel had asked her 3 times before she agreed, and even then, only because his regular social coordinator had food poisoning and he genuinely needed someone who could manage the evening's moving parts without panicking. She was there as his secretary. She knew that. She had no illusions about it. Daniel Harrington appeared at her side, straightening his cufflinks the way he always did when he was slightly nervous, though he would never admit to nervousness in public. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair, and the kind of jaw that made magazine photographers grateful for their jobs. He had built his company, Harrington Capital, from a single rented desk in a shared office in Chicago. And now he was the kind of man rooms rearranged themselves around. People turned when he walked in. Conversations shifted. Emma had watched it happen 100 times in 4 years. "You look fine," he said, which was his version of a compliment. "Thank you," she said, which was her version of patience. They walked toward the terrace together. And that was when Blake Sutton and Reed Calloway materialized from the direction of the open bar. Drinks in hand, grins already in full deployment. Blake was lean and sharp in a charcoal suit, the kind of man who had been handsome in college and knew it. Reed was broader, louder. The one who told the jokes that everyone laughed at because it was easier than not laughing. Blake looked at Daniel, then at Emma, then back at Daniel with the expression of someone who had found a particularly good opportunity for entertainment. "You brought your secretary," Blake said. Not a question. A statement delivered with the particular cruelty of someone who believed social embarrassment was a sport. Daniel opened his mouth. But Reed was already laughing, that big rolling laugh that filled the space before a punchline could even land. "To an engagement party, man. Seriously, your secretary." Emma kept her expression completely neutral. She was very good at that. For years of Daniel's conference calls and client meetings and last-minute scheduled disasters had given her a face that could hold itself perfectly still while everything else moved around it. "Emma handles logistics," Daniel said, and even he seemed to hear how thin that sounded the moment it left his mouth. "Right," Blake said, drawing the word out slowly. "Logistics. At a rooftop engagement party. She's going to tell the orchids where to stand," Reed added, and then laughed at his own joke again. Emma smiled politely and said nothing. The terrace was filling quickly, and Emma quietly stepped away from the 3 of them under the pretense of checking the seating arrangements. She had, in fact, already memorized the seating chart from the emailed document Patrick's event planner had sent to Daniel's office, because that was the kind of thing Emma did without being asked. She moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, noting the placement of the catering staff, the position of the speech's microphone, the small card table near the entrance, where guests were signing a leather-bound memory book. She noticed something else. 2. The florist's assistant, a young woman in a black apron, was standing near the west end of the terrace with an expression of quiet panic, whispering into a phone and staring at the corner where an enormous centerpiece arrangement of white orchids was listing dramatically to one side, threatening to topple directly onto the table where Patrick's elderly grandmother was scheduled to sit in approximately 20 minutes. Emma walked over. The base weight shifted when they moved the table, The florist's assistant whispered miserably. I don't have anything to stabilize it, and my manager isn't picking up, and if that falls on Mrs. Hale, it's going to be a catastrophe. Emma looked at the arrangement. Then she looked around the terrace with the calm, systematic attention she brought to every problem Daniel dropped on her desk. She spotted a folded linen tablecloth on a catering cart near the service entrance, a heavy decorative stone from a nearby potted plant arrangement, and a roll of floral wire the assistant had forgotten she was still holding. Give me that, Emma said gently, nodding at the wire. 6 minutes later, the centerpiece was stable, the base was weighted properly, and the arrangement looked exactly as the florist had intended it to look. The assistant stared at her with something close to reverence. How did you know how to do that? She asked. I planned 3 corporate events last spring, Emma said simply. One of the florists taught me. She smoothed the front of her borrowed dress and turned back toward the party. What she did not see, because she was facing the wrong direction, was Daniel watching her from 20 feet away with an expression that Blake would later describe as someone who had looked at a painting 100 times and only just noticed what it was. Actually, if Blake was beside him, still holding his drink, the laughter gone from his face. She just fixed that entire centerpiece situation in under 10 minutes, Blake said slowly. I know, Daniel said, without making a scene. Without asking anyone for help? Without anyone even noticing there was a problem. I know. Blake was quiet for a moment. Then, with the grace of a man who recognized when he had been genuinely wrong about something, he said, She's not what I thought. Daniel did not answer, but he kept watching Emma as she moved back into the crowd. As she paused to redirect a waiter who was carrying champagne flutes in the wrong direction, as she gently suggested to a cluster of guests that they might want to move slightly left before the speeches began so that Patrick's mother would have a clear sight line to the podium. She managed everything without being asked. Without being seen, the speeches began at 8. And Patrick's voice cracked on the words, "The woman I love," in the way that made half the terrace reach for their champagne glasses as cover for unexpected emotion. Emma was standing near the back, far from the spotlight, one hand resting lightly on the railing that overlooked the city lights of Chicago, stretching out below them like a second sky. Daniel found her there after the applause had faded. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment, which was unusual for him. Daniel Harrington always had something to say. You saved this evening, he finally said, before it even had a chance to go wrong. Emma looked at the city lights. It's my job. No, he said, and something in his voice had changed from the way it sounded in the office, from the way it sounded when he was being her employer. It is not just your job. What you did tonight, the way you moved through this room, the way you handled everything, that is something else entirely. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and found that he was already looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 4 years of working 6 feet from his office door. She did not know what to do with that expression, so she looked back at the city lights. Blake and Reed have stopped laughing, she said. They have, Daniel agreed. Good, she said quietly, and she meant it as the end of the conversation, as the closing of a door. But the way Daniel stayed standing beside her in the warm night air, close enough that she could feel the slight warmth of his presence, suggested that for him it felt much more like a beginning. Emma arrived at the office on Monday morning the same way she always did. Flat shoes clicking softly against the marble lobby floor, plain canvas tote bag over one shoulder, coffee from the corner cart in her hand, hair pulled back into its familiar bun. The glasses were back on her face, large and slightly unflattering, and she wore a gray blouse tucked into wide-leg trousers that told the world nothing about the person inside them. She was invisible again. She preferred it that way, or at least that was what she told herself as she stepped off the elevator onto the 14th floor and walked to her new office. Because Daniel had quietly moved her into a proper office 3 weeks ago with her name on a small placard beside the door. He had done it without announcement, without ceremony, had simply appeared at her old desk one Thursday afternoon and said, "You need a real workspace. Come look at this room." And that had been that. She settled into her chair, opened her laptop, and began pulling up the day's schedule. Daniel had a 9 o'clock call with a real estate investment group in Boston, lunch with a potential new partner at noon, and an internal budget review at 3 that Emma had already prepared 17 pages of supporting documents for. She was halfway through reviewing those documents when her office door opened and Daniel appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. Not the corner cart coffee, the good coffee. The coffee from a small place on West Randolph Street called Harbinger that did a specific oat milk latte Emma had mentioned exactly once. In passing 4 months ago, while telling Chloe over the phone that she had discovered the best coffee in the city, he had clearly been listening. "I was walking past," he said, which was a lie so transparent it was almost charming, because Harbinger was 6 blocks in the opposite direction from Harrington Capitol. Emma looked at the cup, then at him. She took it carefully, both hands wrapped around the warmth of it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and left without making a thing of it. And Emma sat there holding the coffee and feeling something small and dangerous beginning to happen in her chest. She called Chloe at lunch. "He brought me coffee from Harbinger," she said without preamble. Chloe, who was in the middle of assembling a croquembouche for a client, and therefore surrounded by sponge sugar and a great deal of creative stress, went completely silent for 3 seconds. "Emma Clark," she said finally. "That man walked 6 blocks out of his way to bring you a latte. I know. That is not a professional gesture." "I know that too. What are you going to do about it?" Emma was quiet, watching through her office window as a pigeon landed on the ledge outside. She looked at the city with great seriousness and flew away again. "Nothing," she said. "I am going to do nothing because I work for him, and because the last time I let myself feel something at work, it went very badly, and because I am a sensible person." Chloe made a sound that indicated she found sensible people deeply exhausting. "You are hiding again." "I am being cautious." "Emma, there is a difference between caution and building a wall so high nobody can see over it." "I like my wall." "I know you do," Chloe said, her voice going softer. "But honey, not every man is Gregory." Emma did not say anything to that. Gregory was her former employer 2 jobs ago, who had made her last 8 months at that company into something she did not like to think about too carefully. The comments that started small and grew, the way he stood too close, the way he made her feel like she had to earn the right to simply exist in a professional space. She had left that job and she had dressed herself in invisibility like armor, and she had told herself it was a choice, which it was. But choices made from fear were still made from fear. "I have to go back to my desk," she told Chloe. "Think about the wall." Chloe said. Emma thought about the wall. The week moved forward in the quiet accumulation of small things. On Tuesday, Daniel forwarded her an email thread from a client without explanation. And when she looked at it, she realized he had told the client that the strategy they were querying had been Emma's idea, which it had been, but which he had never previously credited her for in external correspondence. She stared at that email for a long time. On Wednesday, he knocked on her office door before entering, which he had not done when she sat at the hallway desk. On Thursday, he stopped in the middle of a budget meeting where a junior analyst named Tom was presenting work that Emma had done the foundational research for, and Daniel said, clearly and without any hedging, "Tom, tell me where this data originated." Tom had gone slightly pink and admitted that Emma had built the data set. Daniel had nodded and said, "Then Emma should present this section," and looked across the table at her with an expression that expected nothing less than exactly that. She had presented it. The room had listened. Afterward, in the hallway, Daniel fell into step beside her. "You know that material better than anyone in that room," he said. "I researched it," she agreed. "You should always present your own work." She stopped walking and looked at him properly. "You've never suggested that before?" Something moved across his face, something that looked like the honest recognition of a fault. "No," he said. "I did not. I should have." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was necessary, then nodded and walked back to her office. And she could feel him watching her go. Friday arrived with a complication. Victor Halston was the kind of businessman who arrived in rooms and immediately began rearranging the social furniture to his advantage. He was 52, silver-haired, and accustomed to people accommodating his preferences before he had finished expressing them. He was also, unfortunately, the potential partner whose lunch Daniel had been working toward for 3 months, and he had finally agreed to a formal dinner meeting at Trevino, one of the city's better restaurants. On Friday evening, Emma had arranged every detail of the dinner: the reservation, the private dining room, the curated menu discussion with the chef, the preparation of a 30-page business overview document that she had revised 4 times to ensure it was exactly right. She was not supposed to attend, but Daniel's business development associate, a capable man named Warren, had a family emergency that afternoon, and by 4 o'clock it was clear that someone needed to be in that room. Who knew the documentation inside and out? Who could answer questions without hesitation? Who understood every number in those 30 pages the way Emma understood? Everything she touched, Daniel, appeared in her office doorway at 4:30. No, it is a Friday evening, he said. Know the documents better than Warren does, she replied, which was true and which was also her way of saying yes. She did not have time to go home and change, so she was still in her Monday through Friday clothes when they arrived at Trevino. The plain blouse, the wide-leg trousers, the glasses, the bun. Victor Halston was already seated, and he looked at Emma the way certain men of a certain age and disposition looked at women who walked into rooms in plain clothes and sensible shoes, which was to say he did not look at her at all. The dinner began politely. Victor was charming in the practiced way of someone for whom charm was simply a business tool. He asked Daniel questions. He sipped his wine with considered appreciation. He was, by all surface measures, a perfectly pleasant dining companion. Then Emma began walking him through the market analysis section of the documents. She was precise, clear, and thorough. She anticipated his questions before he asked them. She moved through figures with the fluency of someone who had built them from the ground up, because she had. She was 3 pages in when Victor held up one hand and smiled the particular smile of someone who was about to be condescending in a very polished way. "This is all very thorough," he said, with gentle, suffocating emphasis on the word thorough. "But I wonder if we might hear from Daniel directly on the strategic direction. No offense to your, he paused, looking at Emma with a pleasant blankness. Your assistant." The table went quiet. Daniel's expression did not change, which was the stillness that Emma had learned to recognize as something very different from calm. "Emma's not my assistant," Daniel said. His voice was perfectly even. "She is the senior analyst who built every piece of research you have in front of you. The market projections, the risk assessment, the competitive landscape review. All of it. Every number you have looked at tonight came from her." Victor raised his eyebrows in a way that suggested he found this charming but not entirely credible. "Furthermore," Daniel continued, and now his voice had that quiet certainty in it that made boardrooms pay attention, "if the people in your organization cannot hear expertise because of what it looks like when it walks in the room, then I am not certain our companies should be partners." Victor blinked. "I simply meant—" "I know what you meant," Daniel said. "Not unkindly, but absolutely without give." "Emma, please continue," she continued. Victor Halston listened for the rest of the dinner with considerably more attention than he had managed before, in the taxi afterward. Emma and Daniel sat in the quiet of the back seat and watched the city move past the windows. "Did not have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did." She turned to look at him in the low light of the passing street lamps. His profile was serious, settled, facing forward. "The engagement party," she said slowly. "The coffee. The email credit. Tonight, what are you doing, Daniel?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I'm trying to be the kind of person who deserves to know you." She looked at him for a long moment and then looked back at the city lights sliding past the window, and the wall that Chloe was always talking about developed for the very first time. A small an irreparable crack. 3 weeks after the dinner at Trevino, Emma came into the office on a Tuesday morning to find something on her desk that was not coffee. It was a travel brochure, not a glossy corporate one, a real one. The old-fashioned kind with soft paper and photographs that had been carefully selected rather than algorithmically generated. Scotland, the cover read in quiet, serious lettering. And below that, the image of a castle sitting at the edge of a gray-green loch under a sky that could not decide between storm and clearing. She stood there in her coat with her tote bag still over her shoulder, staring at it. Inside the front cover, in Daniel's handwriting, which she recognized from years of reading his margin notes on documents, was a single line. "You mentioned this once." I wrote it down. She sat down very slowly. She had mentioned Scotland exactly once, to Chloe on the phone 2 years ago, while sitting at her old hallway desk. She had not been talking to Daniel. She had barely been talking loudly. She had said something about how she had wanted to see the Highlands since she was a girl reading books about castles, and that one day she would actually go. He had heard it. He had written it down. He had kept it for 2 years. She put the brochure in her tote bag, did not say anything about it for 2 days. On the second day, Chloe came to meet her for lunch in the small park across from Harrington Capitol. And Emma took the brochure out and put it on the bench between them without explanation. Chloe looked at it. "Read the inscription." Looked at Emma. "He wrote it down," Emma said. "I see that. 2 years ago. Chloe, he heard me talking to you on the phone, and he wrote down that I wanted to go to Scotland." Chloe was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for Chloe. Then she said, "Emma, that man has been paying attention to you for a very long time, I know. And you are still sitting on a park bench in your glasses and your gray blouse being afraid." Emma took her glasses off and rubbed the bridge of her nose, which was something she rarely did in public. Without them, her face looked different, softer, more like the person she was when she was at home in her apartment with her books and her candles, and the ease of her own company. "What if it changes?" she said. "What if I let him in, and then it changes, and I am back to being someone who has to reinvent herself just to feel safe? What if it does not change?" Chloe said simply. Emma had no answer for that. She put her glasses back on and picked up the brochure and held it in both hands. Looking at the castle on the cover with its stone walls and its quiet permanence, "Tell me what to do," she said. "You know what to do," Chloe said. "You have known for weeks. You are just waiting until it feels less terrifying. Will it ever feel less terrifying?" Chloe took a long sip of her iced tea. "No," she said honestly. "But you do it anyway. That is sort of the whole point." Emma went back to the office. She knocked on Daniel's door. He looked up from his desk, and something in his expression shifted immediately the way it always did now when she appeared. That quality of attention he brought to her that was different from how he looked at anything else in the room. "Brochure," she said. He waited. "You heard me talking to Chloe 2 years ago and you wrote it down." "Did," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up from behind his desk, which he only did when something mattered enough to stand up for, because even then, he said carefully, "Even before the engagement party, before the gala, before I had the vocabulary for what I was feeling, something about you made me want to pay attention. The way you solved problems. The way you were kind to people when no one was watching. The way you talked about books and Scotland and cappuccinos with good foam like they were genuinely precious things. I was not seeing clearly. I know that. I spent a long time not seeing clearly. But I was paying attention even when I did not understand why." Stood in the doorway of his office holding the Scotland brochure and felt the crack in her wall open into something much wider and much more irreversible. "I am not easy to know," she said. "I have rules that I built for reasons, and I do not apologize for them. I know," he said. "I will not be decorative. I will not soften myself for anyone's comfort. I will not pretend to be less capable than I am to make a room feel more balanced. I would never ask you to. And if you hurt me," she said, and her voice was very level and very serious, "I will not rebuild myself around the hurt this time. I will simply leave. That is fair, he said. That is completely fair. She looked at him for a long moment. He stood on the other side of his desk, in his good suit, with his honest face, and his notes about Scotland kept for 2 years. And he looked back at her without flinching. Then something happened that almost dismantled all of it. Blake Sutton called Daniel's mobile during a Friday evening gathering at Reed's apartment, and Emma, who had come at Daniel's quiet insistence because he wanted her to meet his friends properly this time, was standing near the kitchen when she overheard the tail end of a conversation between Blake and Reed that turned her stomach cold. She could not hear all of it, just fragments. Reed saying something about a bet, an old one, from years ago, about whether Daniel could ever keep a secretary longer than 18 months, and Blake laughing and saying something about Daniel having found a more personal incentive this time. She set down her glass. She picked up her coat. She was almost at the door when Daniel caught up with her. Emma. I heard them, she said. She was not angry in any explosive way. She was that worst kind of quiet. Whatever you heard, was it ever a joke to you? She said. Any of it. The coffee, the book, the office. Was any of it strategy? No, he said immediately. Emma, look at me. She looked at him. Blake and Reed were talking about something from years ago that had nothing to do with you and nothing to do with how I feel. I cannot control what they say to each other. I can only tell you what is true. He held her gaze with the kind of steadiness that was difficult to manufacture. You are not a game. You have never been a game. The moment you walked away from me at that engagement party and spent the rest of the evening making sure everything ran perfectly, I started understanding how much I had been missing. Not your appearance, you, the actual person. She was quiet. I know you have reasons for your walls, he said. I know someone gave you those reasons. And I know I have to earn every inch of ground here, and I am prepared to do that for as long as it takes. Reed appeared in the hallway behind them, looking genuinely remorseful. Emma, he said, what I said in there was stupid and unkind. I was joking about something old and irrelevant, and I am sorry. What Daniel has with you is the most serious I've ever seen him about anything. Blake appeared beside Reed, nodded once, and said, he turned down a golf trip to Boston last month because you were presenting at the industry conference, and he wanted to be there. Emma looked at Daniel. You were there? She said. 3rd row, he said. You were extraordinary. She stood in the hallway of Reed's apartment, with her coat over her arm and the Scotland brochure still in her bag from 2 days ago, and she thought about walls and what they kept out alongside. What they kept in? She thought about Chloe saying, you do it. Anyway, she took a breath. There is a small hotel in the Highlands, she said slowly, that I read about in that brochure. It sits at the edge of a loch, and it has a library with a fireplace, and apparently the coffee is very good. Daniel was very still. I have not taken a holiday in 3 years, she continued, her voice finding its footing. I think I would like to go in the spring. And I think, she paused, feeling the last edge of the wall come down with a quiet finality that surprised her with how light it felt. I think I would not entirely mind company. The smile that came across Daniel Harrington's face was nothing like the polished, professional expression Emma had spent 4 years cataloging from 6 feet away. It was unguarded and a little overwhelmed, and entirely real. I will not be decorative company, he said, borrowing her word back to her. Now she agreed, and she smiled too, the full version. The one she saved for Chloe in good books, and the first sip of a perfect cappuccino. You will have to carry the bags and navigate and listen to me talk about every castle we pass. I have been listening to you, he said quietly, for a very long time. Blake cleared his throat from the hallway behind them and said nothing more, which was perhaps the most mature thing he had managed in 40 years of living. Reed had already gone back to the kitchen with the tact of someone who recognized a moment and knew enough to leave it alone. Emma and Daniel stood in the warm light of the hallway, and between them, something settled into place with the quiet certainty of something that had been trying to find its way there for a long time. Not the woman in a borrowed dress under fairy lights. Not the invisible secretary with the forgettable bun. Just Emma Clark, with her walls finally down and her eyes clear and her whole self present in the room. Deciding that some things were worth the risk of being fully seen.